Welcome. In this session, we'll address the spinothalamic system, a sensory system. The spinothalamic pathway, the lateral spinothalamic pathway, provides for the perception and localization of pain and temperature because of its somatotopic representation in the postcentral gyrus. On a neurologic exam, testing cutaneous sensation with cold or a pointed object is a very useful method for assessing sensory loss due to damage either the peripheral nerve lesion or lesions in this central pathway. The sensitivity and spatial resolution of pain and temperature make it an excellent modality for dermatomal mapping. Both the central and peripheral processes of these cells consist of unmyelinated and small myelinated axons. The receptors are mainly free nerve endings. These differ in all regards from the dorsal column lemniscal pathway. The lateral spinothalamic pathway is an ascending three-neuron chain, centrally directed processes from peripheral nerves, who have their cell body in the dorsal root ganglia, enter the spinal cord, and then immediately branch into a small intersegmental tract known as the tract of Lissauer to synapse in the dorsal horn across several segments on that same side. The cells that those primary neurons synapse on are secondary neurons in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and those second order neurons decussate in the spinal cord, and those fibers enter the anterolateral portion of the cord and turn upward to ascend in the lateral spinothalamic tract. The tract stays in that anterolateral position in the cord and relocates more laterally throughout the brainstem. And finally synapses in the thalamus, in ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus, on third order neuron. The axons of the third order neuron project through the internal capsule to the postcentral gyrus of the primary somatosensory cortex. We see here that the fibers of the second order neuron that we see represented here in the dorsal horn of the dorsal gray decussate at the anterior white commissure, just anterior to the central canal of the spinal cord, to occupy a position in the anterolateral position of the cord. And they ascend in the lateral funiculus, just ventral to the corticospinal tract. Here, the fibers are designated as the lateral spinothalamic tract. Then they'll ascend through the various levels of the spinal cord in that lateral position, and then travel into the brainstem and stay in a lateral position all the way up until they reach the thalamus. The spinothalamic pathway is also referred to as the anterolateral system because of its position in the cord. Pain and temperature fibers ascend and descend a few segments in the dorsolateral tract of Lissauer, and we see that represented here, right above the dorsal portion of the dorsal horn. We see the dorsolateral tract of Lissauer, and that carries fibers up and down a couple of segments in the spinal cord before they synapse in the substantia gelatinosa and then eventually travel to other locations. This spread along the dorsolateral tract of Lissauer enables protective pain reflexes that are withdrawal reflexes to utilize multiple segments to carry out those reflexes. The blood supply to the spinothalamic pathway is shown here, starting out in the spinal cord, and we see the anterior spinal artery sitting in the midline feeds the entire ventral and lateral portion of the spinal cord, including the spinothalamic tract and the corticospinal tract sitting here. And that same anterior spinal artery feeds both sides. As we move up into the medulla, we see that we have the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which feeds the lateral portion of the medulla, and we see here the anterior lateral system is fed by the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, along with the spinal trigeminal tract and nucleus, and the vestibular nuclei, and portion of the cerebellar peduncle, known as the restiform body. We see that the medial lemniscus is far medial and is not fed by that artery. As you move into the pons, the anterior inferior cerebellar artery feeds this lateral portion of the pons, including the spinothalamic pathway. This pathway stays lateral throughout its extent, and notice that the pathway carries information about touch, but it's only crude touch, as opposed to the fine touch carried by the medial lemniscal pathway, the dorsal column lemniscal pathway. We see here schematically the pathway ascending in the lateral funiculus through the spinal cord, through the brainstem, up to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus onto the cortex. We see here that the input for that pathway is from free nerve endings through dorsal root into the dorsal horn, having traveled through Lissauer's tract a number of segments up or down in the spinal cord. And then in the spinal cord, it travels over to the other side within 2 segments, and then stays in a lateral position all the way through the spinal cord, through the brainstem, synapses in the thalamus on the 3rd order cell, and at the 3rd order cell travels through the internal capsule up to the postcentral gyrus, Brodmann area 3, 1, and 2. If we look at the location of these fibers at each level of its ascent, we see that the dorsal root fibers come in and will travel into Lissauer's tract up and down for a number of segments, and then synapse in the dorsal portion of the dorsal horn, and then secondary neurons will send their axons across the midline in the anterior white commissure to take up a position in the lateral funiculus, in the lateral spinothalamic tract. We see up here the dorsal columns, distant from the spinothalamic tract. Recognize that the incoming fibers, the primary afferents in the pain and lateral spinothalamic system, are C fibers that are unmyelinated, and A delta fibers, which are thin, lightly myelinated fibers. As we move up towards the spinal medullary junction, we see that the spinothalamic tract stays in the lateral position that it's been in the spinal cord. And this is at the spinal medullary junction at the caudal medulla, and it's in the same position that it's been initially in the spinal cord, just a little more lateral. Recognize the dorsal column nuclei more dorsally, and the medial lemniscus at the midline and the pyramids near the midline. As we go up a little bit higher into the medulla, at the middle medulla, we can see that the spinothalamic tract has stayed in its lateral position, quite distant from the medial lemniscus and distant from the pyramids. We can also see that it's just dorsal to and relatively lateral to from the inferior olivary nucleus. And we see also the fourth ventricle in the inferior cerebellar peduncle. As we move up into the pons, we see now that the spinothalamic tract is in the same lateral position, but the medial lemniscus fibers have shifted more dorsally and the leg area has moved out laterally, approaching the lateral spinothalamic tract. And at this level, we can see the basis pontus with the corticospinal fibers, and we can see the middle cerebellar peduncle and the superior cerebellar peduncle, as well as the fourth ventricle. As we move into the caudal midbrain, we see that the spinothalamic tract is still in the lateral position. The medial lemniscus has caught up to the spinothalamic tract in its lateral position. We also see the crossing fibers of the decussation of the cerebellar peduncle. As we move into the rostral midbrain, we see now that the spinothalamic tract and the medial lemniscus are close together. We can also see the red nucleus, the crus cerebri, as well as periaqueductal gray and cerebral aqueduct. As we move up towards the thalamus, we see the fibers are going to synapse on the third order neuron in the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. And from there, they'll project up to the cortex with the leg medial and the arm more lateral. Trunk is intermediate between the two. They're going to come up to the postcentral gyrus, which is this gyrus just behind the precentral gyrus. And this also recognizes other fibers that had come originally from the brainstem nuclei from the cranial nerves that are going to provide sensory information for pain and temperature for the head. And they synapse in the thalamus at the ventral posterior medial nucleus and then send their axons to the lateral portion of the postcentral gyrus out here, just above the lateral fissure. And we can see that these are traveling through the internal capsule. It should actually show them traveling right through this portion of the internal capsule. Lesions to the lateral spinothalamic tract in the brainstem or above, as with all the other two tracts, we've looked at the corticospinal and the dorsal column medial lemniscus, produce contralateral signs on the body. So damage in the brainstem or above produces contralateral signs for pain and temperature, vibration position, as well as paralysis in an upper motor neuron lesion. But specifically for this pathway, these are contralateral losses of pain and temperature sensation. However, this pathway differs in that lesions in the spinal cord produce contralateral pain and temperature loss below the level of lesion. This is because the decussation of the fibers in the cord is close to the level of entry of the primary pain and temperature fibers. The sensory level produced by lesion of this pathway also differs from the medial lemniscus effect, and that is, it does consist of a sensory loss that proceeds from the proximity downward, but it differs from the dorsal column lemniscal pathway in the following ways. The sensory level is contralateral to the location of the lesion, and the sensory loss starts one or two segments below the location of the lesion due to Lissauer's tract carrying information up and down a couple of segments. The effect of lesions is demonstrated here symbolically, and that is in the cerebral cortex. All of these are in reference to anesthesia in which there's a loss of pain and temperature sensation, and that is in both the cerebral cortex, in the internal capsule, in the thalamus, that is in VPL, nucleus of the thalamus, in the brainstem, through all the way down through the medulla, as well as in the spinal cord. Damage to any one of those locations will produce contralateral deficit below the lesion. If there is damage on the peripheral nerve or in the spinal cord level, right at the arrival of the dorsal root ganglion, there would be loss of sensation ipsilateral. This effect of lateral spinothalamic lesions in the spinal cord, as we've indicated, is somewhat distinct due to the lateral spinothalamic lesion that might be at T8. In this case, if you have a lesion at T8 in the spinothalamic tract, it would produce a sensory level starting at T10, because these fibers that were traveling across to the midline would be blocked when they start to ascend. Whereas fibers that peripheral nerves that come in at T9, they would send their fibers in Lissauer's tract above T8, and also fibers in T8 would send their fibers in Lissauer's tract above T8 on the opposite side, so they would cross over higher up. And as a result, this person who has a lesion at T8 would have pain and temperature loss at T10 and below. If there are any questions, don't hesitate to give me a call.